I'm talking to Graham Russell, Head of Global Transactional Processing at AstraZeneca. Graham, talk to me about locations that you consider to be hot and those that you consider not.
Well, firstly, I'll have to define hot, and by that I would say those that are popular and attractive, as opposed to hot being market hot. So I'd be looking for those locations that offer good talent, a reasonable level of attrition, so that you're not losing your people every day. And I tend to think of those like some of the, let's say in the European sense, some of the near Eastern European countries, places like Poland, but away from the bigger cities. If I look at the Far East, I'm looking at places like Malaysia. And in terms of what's not hot, and again, the definition being you don't want attrition and so on, places like Bangalore is where you wouldn't want to go right now because the market is so hot. The people attrition rate is extremely high. The same could be said in places like Prague for Europe. So those are the places I would tend to stay away from at this point in time.
Graham, does location matter if you're outsourcing?
I think it absolutely does. Whether I'm outsourcing or offshoring, one of the key ingredients for me is the people element. And therefore the source and availability of people is a big driver in my location selection. And so if I was outsourcing and they said it didn't matter, I would disagree with them.
Graham, what sort of new locations are you considering?
In terms of new locations, I think that places like India today, for example, has got to a point where, as I said, markets like Bangalore are very hot. So you want to be in the non-hot places. I think India will be a good location for a long time to come, but it has to be away from the hotter markets of Bangalore. So I myself an experience in Chennai, for example, which turned out to be a very good location. I think in places like China, that will become more popular going forward, but it's going to be in those locations where you can attract the right language skills, both for Asia Pacific, or for Asia Pacific principally, and that actually focuses you on a very narrow piece of China, which makes that part of the market hot from the unattractive standpoint. As you get into Europe, again, I think some of the lesser known cities in Poland, for example, you're going to need to find a large geography and pretty much untapped areas, but with easy access to the good universities. So I tend to think of some of the secondary and even tertiary cities in Poland likely to be the next big things to happen in Europe. And the way the economy is going these days, I sort of jokingly say to people that 5 or 10 years from now, a cheap location will be the US, or maybe even the UK. So I think this will come in cycles, and it will change over the next 5 or 10 years.
Graham, what would you say were the key characteristics of locations for outsourcing?
Very good question. I would say they fall into 3 broad categories, Sarah. I'd say they're labour, cost, and country environment, country landscape, if you will. And key in each of those would be under labour, it's availability of talent, it's proximity to universities, it's the availability of foreign languages, competitive market forces, what does attrition look like in that environment. On cost, it's the absolute dollars and cents, or the euros of what it takes to get those folks in, what it takes to retain and develop them. And again, that attrition factor. If they leave, what's the cost or the opportunity cost of that? And then perhaps the third category is the one that I characterize as country landscape. So it's, what's the sovereign risk in the country? What's the political landscape in that country? What's their views on taxation? What's their views on education? How many other companies are there? Are you there on your own? Are you there with other multinationals? It's that whole set of economic and political factors that greatly influence your choice.
What sort of weight would you give that last category?
I would say it's a pre-qualifier. So it's not just a weight. I'd say that countries would not make my list if I couldn't tick some of those boxes in that category.